Right, before we start today's session, I'd like to just hand you over to Margaret Tappin from Investing in Ethnicity. Margaret.
Hi, afternoon everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. Today's session, of course, is Inclusive Leaders for Better Diverse Teams. So we've got Sarah, who is our CEO, and Ailey McLeod, who is CEO. We've also got two fantastic speakers to join us today, so the conversation should be really interesting. So this will be really about empowering others and using language and hopefully taking some really advanced actions back to the workplace. So those of you that know us, I'm hoping that most of you are members, but I'm sure we've got a few that are not as members as yet. So please drop us a line, drop me a line, just if you want to know more about all the other initiatives that we do, which will be the maturity matrix, the action groups we do monthly, the awards. Also, just to let you know, the maturity matrix will be relaunched in April. So if you haven't done it and you want to do it, then please keep updated with what we're doing with that. And Sarah will basically take you through the rest of the session. And if you've got any questions, there's also a chat box. Drop us any sort of questions you have. If you don't want to do it now, then you can also drop me a line anytime after. We'll try and get back to you with all the answers as soon as possible. There's also a poll. So if you see the poll pop up, then please, enter, participate so we get the best results possible.
Fantastic. It is 4 p.m. So we've made this workshop as engaging as possible, and we've got the beauty of the experts as well, our winners of the Ethnicity Awards, our Champion Ally category. So we've got our joint winners from there as well, which we'll introduce you to in a second. But firstly, as Margaret mentioned, we've got chat, we've got questions, so do ask questions, and we've got a quick poll as well. A lot of you may know we have released our toolkit last year, which is at investinginethnicity.com, Ethnicity Allies, which has videos. It has a toolkit with a checklist on the actions that you can take back to the workplace as an ally, which also links into how you manage as well, manage your teams. So onto the guidelines, Ailey.
Yeah, just a bit of housekeeping for everyone. So I'm sure we're all very used to this by now, but Sarah, if you want to bring up all the squares, just the usual, phones and distractions off, please. Obviously, if you close down other applications, hopefully you won't get disconnected from us at any point. Today we're going to learn by participating, so it's interactive. Hopefully you are all on a device that will allow you to enter things into the chat box and see polls. Be open and honest with yourself and others. It's not an easy subject to talk about for anyone. Even people like Sarah and I have been doing it for years. It's still a difficult topic to talk about. So
we're always learning.
Making mistakes is okay. We're all learning. It's a lifelong process, and this is a safe space. It's confidential. So anything that you put in the chat that you don't want anyone else to see, if you send it just to panelists. Otherwise, if you'd like to share with everyone, then send to panelists and everyone else.
Yeah, it's a good opportunity to share anything you've seen as well and your experiences in chat, and maybe share with the wider audience out there.
Yeah. So some of the things we'll talk about might feel uncomfortable, but just try and sit with that discomfort and power through it. And we promise that it'll be better on the other side.
Okay, so now over to just an introduction from our speakers today. And just as I mentioned, they are Ethnicity Awards joint champion winners. Our judges felt that they were really good at submissions, and they've done so much work that we needed to recognise both of them last year, which is a bit of a first for the Ethnicity Awards. Just over to you, Claire Wills from Freshfields. Just over to you first, and a bit of an introduction from yourself.
Thanks very much. So I am a partner in an international law firm that's called Freshfields, and I have been there for 28 years. I became managing partner of our London office in February 2019, and very much wanted to make diversity and inclusion at the heart of my strategic priorities for my term as managing partner. I was really delighted to get the Champion Ally Award with Matthew, and delighted to be invited to join you all today. So I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much. Thanks for joining. And Matthew, Newick. So it's a good year for law firms, isn't it? So from Clifford Chance, a quick introduction, please.
A similar sort of story to Claire's, really, a leadership role in our organisation as well. And I was keen as well when I came into that role to make this one of my most important strategic priorities, expressly so. I'm a little bit embarrassed that on the slide there I get a grand title and Claire doesn't, even though she's got one just as grand. So that feels a bit unfair.
Apologies for that.
Fine with me.
So I think the only thing I'd add, as a sort of partner, I'm a sort of a litigator in terms of my part of the business, and head of that practice within the firm. For these purposes, also significant, I suppose, that I'm the partner champion, or one of the partner champions, of our Race Equality Celebrating Heritage Affinity Group, which does some fantastic work in the organisation.
Fantastic. And just a quick question to both of you, like, why do you think the whole allyship piece, particularly within the race agenda, is so important, and particularly now as well, maybe reflecting on like the past year as well? So Matthew, maybe I'll go to you first. Sorry.
All right. Well, I guess the starting point for me is just the very personal issue about the personal commitment to advancing race equality, diversity, inclusion. So that's the personal starting point. But I think importantly, there's also, with my business hat on, a really significant strategic business driver for it. And it's all about performance. It's all about making ourselves a better organisation. And when I say that, I mean, if we think about the competition for talent, so the competition between Freshfields and Clifford Chance for talent, for example, is extremely acute, not to mention a whole lot of others. Why would we limit where we're looking for talent in a particular part of the population? It just makes no sense to me at all. Equally, we know, and there's plenty of science to prove this, that diverse thinking makes for better outputs. So that's all about improving the quality of what we can do for our clients ultimately. And then finally, we also know that people will not be able to perform at their best in our organisation if we make some of them feel like outsiders. So that's all about driving performance as well. So those are the sorts of things I have in mind about this being so important to making ourselves better, and white allyship is one of the ways in which we can achieve that, it seems to me. The other point I'd mention is that we know, if we're honest with ourselves, that the problem of structural bias and racial equality still exists in our organisation, in our society, in our industry. And no matter how meritocratic we think we are, the data tells us that we're not, because you look around at particularly the senior end of firms like ours, and it's still very white, still too white. And just on the meritocracy point, one of the things I think is interesting about that concept of meritocracy is one of the things I've always loved about my firm, and I've been there for 31 years, which is just to beat Claire's 28 years, is that I've loved the culture of meritocracy. So we are genuinely in our hearts meritocratic. We want people to succeed in our organisation, whatever their background. But, and this is a big but, is that we are kidding ourselves if we think that we've become meritocratic in reality, in practice already. And I'm ashamed to say that it was only relatively recently, in the last small number of years, that I've come to realise how insulting it is to say we are a meritocracy. Because what it implies, of course, is that good looks mainly white. And that's just not an acceptable proposition to me. So I do think that's an important, really important thing to sort of battle that concept and make sure we are genuinely more meritocratic. And then ultimately the point is that when you come from almost cartoon character privilege, there's first of all a platform to use that privilege to make a difference, but also then I think a very significant responsibility to do so, both for the sort of justice and fairness type reasons, but also to make the organisation better.
Thanks, Matthew. Yeah, and your point to meritocracy is like, that is such a myth that we need to sort of overcome. Claire, particularly around like inclusive leadership and like allyship and how we move forward on this. Why do you feel it's so important from your points of view and your experiences?
Well, there is the personal point that Matthew started with, and my personal point is I have loved my 28 years at the firm. That's why I'm still there. I feel that there are people invested in me, and I'm invested in people, and there is that sense of belonging. And I must say, as I have spent longer at Freshfields, and I've had the privilege of getting into a leadership position, it does really open your eyes in terms of the journey and the opportunities that I've had that maybe others, it's not open to others, or they don't think it's open to them. And I see allyship, well, there are many facets to it. I think there is the day-to-day positive actions that you can do to make somebody feel like they belong in a place, and that they've got a future with a place and a career with a place. I think there is a kindness and empathy facet to it. I also get that I'm in rooms that others aren't in, and that I have an opportunity to influence in a way that others don't get to influence. So for me, it's doing the day-to-day stuff in the right way, but it's also making sure that from a strategic perspective, when I have an opportunity to influence, to make our firm much more inclusive, then that's absolutely what I should be doing. But not just me, we should have leaders across the business that are doing the same thing, that can make a real difference. So it's got lots of different facets. I feel that there are allies that are champions, and then there are allies that need other champions too. So I think it's got many facets. I think it's absolutely crucial to the change, though, that we need to bring, particularly in law firms and professional service firms.
Mm-hmm. That's really valid, and it's really key. Like, definitely different people as well have different sort of areas and responsibilities. And today we're talking about line managers, but we're also going to include sort of some workshops, and we're going to engage all those on this call to help us to sort of move forward within this area, because the line managers are such an important area of the business, and an area which we so often see that that's the area where the pipeline and retention figures sort of drop off as well. So just the format of this workshop is around, the first section is understanding what racism is. Second section is around a really deep dive into microaggressions, and as line managers, how we can positively interrupt those behaviours, and a bit about conversation as well. But also a look at some of the actions that we can do back in the workplace, and we're going to have Matthew and Claire helping us along that journey. So just first, to kick us off and make sure you're all engaged in this, just wanted to ask a question, a quick poll. Do you think people are confused by what constitutes racism in the workplace? And I want as many of you answering that as possible. So our results say we have, do you think people are confused by what constitutes racism at work? And we had a resounding yes, 85% say yes, 9% say no, and 8% say unsure. It'd be great to hear in the chat box as well any comments, and Margaret will be feeding through any comments from anyone around their sort of thoughts on that. So just moving on, like, obviously a lot of work's been done over the last year with organisations and ERGs around sort of trying to look at educating around and awareness around racism, and how that racism in society pops up in the workplace and how it manifests itself at work. I just wanted to quickly go over this, and some people might have seen this, but just as a refresher on this area, just understanding a bit more about the basics of racism. So in society, we do have systemic racism and the macro side, which is systemic and institutional. So systemic is, if you imagine a society without any people in, that form of racism would still exist, and that can manifest itself in history, economics, healthcare, and it involves the whole society. And then below that, we have institutional, which looks at policies, practices, and if you imagine how it manifests itself in workplaces, from anything from recruitment policies to our procedures and bonuses, all of that side of it, and all that structure that's in place in the workplace. And then we have the micro level of as part of the 4 dimensions of racism, which are the internalized side. And I know lots of people must have at least seen a bit around unconscious bias training, or even undertaken some training in the workplace. And that's more like the internalized sides and our own biases. And then the 4th, and the section we're going to concentrate on today, which leads into a lot around what line managers can do, is around that interpersonal side of racism, which manifests itself in the workplace as those subtle acts and microaggressions and those interpersonal behaviors. So that will give you a quick idea. I just wanted to ensure if there's any comments on chat, Margaret, do chip in as well if anyone's got any comments to any findings. But the last,
sorry, so there's what someone said, ignorance rather than confused.
That's a really good point. Thank you for
We've got
that.
some great comments coming through actually. So Raj actually says, this is for Matthew and Claire, that Raj wishes there had been people like you in place when Raj was being interviewed 30 years ago.
Oh, that's a lovely comment.
Nina thinks that there's confusion around what's banter. So unconscious bias, absolutely. What borders on racism. And lots of people can't understand forms of racism like microaggressions because they're not overt. So they're covert. Some really, really great comments coming through in the chat.
Yeah,
keep them coming.
Confuse racism with prejudice.
Yeah, and those nuances, because some people find it quite hard to hear the word racism, is, know how we use that language as compared to even how much we use it compared to sexism, for instance, in a workplace context. So really valid comments. Do keep the comments coming because it's really important. Everyone's learning, so it's important to learn off each other. But what I just wanted to finish off on this slide is how we think about those 4 areas and how they influence each other. So for instance, how your biases can influence how your interpersonal and microaggressions manifest themselves, but also those micro level areas can influence policy from sort of those people who are decision makers within the organization. So everything feeds off each other, and essentially it's about us challenging those within the workplace. But do check our toolkit, which is online, for extra information and examples on that. So just a quick, this isn't a poll, this is more for chat. I just wanted to ask you, what do you feel are the biggest challenges for or with line managers as well? This session's on, and hopefully we can sort of have a look at that and address that while we go into the session on microaggressions. So do ask questions, and also when appropriate, our speakers as well will come and reply. And if you want to direct any questions to anyone in particular, please do so. So let's start thinking about that area. I just wanted to go, while you're thinking about that, back to our speakers and just ask a question, because it's well documented about the frozen middle and, as mentioned, the leaking pipeline around there. Just wondered, what can organisations do to better support line managers, or what can be done? So just over to Claire first.
So I was going to say that line managers need to understand that it is their job. So, so I think it's really important that organisations are making it very clear around their strategic priorities that this is absolutely something that they, one, there cannot be, that you must stamp out racism, but 2, how we go about building that inclusive agenda and feeling of belonging around the workplace. And it's very important that people get that it is their job. And I think you have to look at that in 2 ways. One, you have to make sure that when people are being appraised, that it is actually at the heart of their appraisal and their performance conversation. But 2, you want people to feel positive as well and really, really engaged in the conversation. And I do think there is probably a lack of confidence in some places around how to talk about issues. And we've been doing some training at work around how to talk about race, which I think people have really welcomed as a learning opportunity, as you said right at the start, Sarah, and understanding that mistakes can be made as long as the intention is right, but you do have to learn, and you do have to listen. So I do think there is something around training. I've heard some bizarre comments. I've heard somebody said, well, we can't have racism because we've got the right policies in place. And they just don't get that policies don't necessarily translate into what is actually happening for people on the ground. So I do think being clear on management, being clear on the strategic priorities, I do think having the right sort of training is really important. We have put in place across our business at that manager level strategic leads to help actively and specifically help on racism and diversity and inclusion in a particular product area. And that's been really great, actually, because people have got together, those strategic leads, and are talking around what's working and what's not working so well in their groups. So I think having empowering a number of your leaders across the business to really take the lead and to be really impactful in their business area has been positive for us.
I like the way that your examples actually lead off to like that sort of previous around the four areas of racism, how like organizations can help by implementing more around accountability for line managers and making sure they're accountable, but also how individuals need to work as well. That's really useful and bringing it to life. Matthew, so what are your thoughts on what organizations or what have you seen at Clifford Chance that's really worked?
Consistent with what Claire says, actually, but hopefully not identical, which is good. I mean, I was going to make the point about appraisals and objective setting. I think that's really important. And that has to be just an active part of the performance discussion and the contribution that individuals have to make. That's really at every level of the organization, but particularly line managers and above. So that was one point. The other point that I think, or two more points. One is I think it's incredibly important to be transparent and honest about what the data is telling you. And just to illustrate that by my own working group in our organization, and it's I've always thought, and I still think it's a sort of culturally a nice group. It's full of nice, well-intentioned, liberal-minded, open people, but it's pretty white. And when we looked at the data, and we've been doing a lot of work around the firm on understanding the data, collecting the data, making sure that we're doing things in response to it. And when we looked at the data for my working group, which is a very big working group, we could see that at almost every level, we were falling behind the rest of the firm as far as people of color were concerned. So fewer were expressing an interest in coming to us. When they applied, we were accepting fewer than the rest of the firm proportionately. People were leaving us earlier, and we were promoting fewer people of color. So we could see from the data, and it was just unavoidable, that something was going wrong. There were barriers in our part of the organization, leaving aside all the rest of the barriers that exist. We just weren't doing as well as the rest of the firm. And understanding the data, and we were honest with the team about that, and we've sought now to do some stuff to address that. So I thought that was really important, and it was a real wake-up call for all of us well-meaning people in that part of the business who didn't quite realize the problem we had. But that then leads to the next point, I think, which is, and it's very closely related to Claire's point, that I think we need to make our teams and our people, not just line managers, but all of us, sort of own the issue, own the obligation to make our organizations and our working groups within those organizations more inclusive. And just to illustrate that, and this in a sense I think is a really positive story from that same working group of which I'm part, partly in response to this data, but partly because we knew we needed to do it anyway, was we went out to our team and we said, we're setting up these working groups. And this was not just on ethnicity, by the way, other aspects of diversity and inclusion as well. And we want you to get involved. We want you to form working groups to help us understand the issues within our local organization and design some programs to address it. And the first thing that was mind-blowingly exciting and positive was just the turnout, the response. And this is not just from affected minority members of our group, but also from the majority. And that was the best piece of it all. People recognized that there was something to achieve here and they had a role to play, which I thought was fabulous. But what was even more fabulous was when they set about doing their jobs, the quality of analysis, thought, perception, and then most importantly, practical recommendations that came back were terrific. And so in a sense, it just proved to me that sharing the responsibility for this particular part of the strategic agenda was absolutely key. This is not about saying this is a diversity and inclusion team problem, this is an HR problem, this is a leadership problem, this is for all of us. And that was a really, really fairly moving phase in our evolution, actually.
Sarah, can I just come in on
Yes,
one point?
Yes, please.
Matthew, I agree with all of that. I mean, one point I wanted to talk about was just the impact of the pandemic as well.
That's really important.
Because particularly in my business, I'm sure it's the same in Matthew's, people are feeling pretty exhausted at the moment, particularly managers who've been trying to manage their own well-being plus the well-being of their teams. And I had seen a real momentum sort of shift in the business in terms of, as Matthew was saying, this being everybody's issue. But I do get the sense that line managers are feeling quite exhausted, and I worry therefore that their prioritization in terms of what matters, and particularly on the diversity and inclusion front, could slip away a bit as people are in a bit of survival mode. So I do think there is a well-being point that we have to think about as well, and therefore I do think we have to keep really positively engaging with line managers, that this is at the heart of what their job is and what they should be doing, because I think people are feeling a bit tired and exhausted, and I just wanted to raise that as an issue and maybe get other thoughts. I'd be interested on the chat in terms of whether people are experiencing maybe a leap forward and then are coming back again as everyone's feeling a bit exhausted.
Yeah, I think that's a really valid point, particularly reflective. Last year, we saw like a really huge appetite for this whole allyship piece and understanding around race. But everybody, like you said, they are in a survival mode. And this is like the period of time where we need to actually positively sort of unite on different agendas like this and in a positive way. I do agree with you, but really, really good to hear your feedback as well, that you're seeing as participants on this, that you're seeing within your organisation what the mood is in your organisation on this agenda as well, and I hear your feedback on that. Conscious of time, so.
Okay, we've got a few comments. Just line managers are not confident to talk about this in fear of getting it wrong, therefore remain quiet.
Yeah, it's empowering. It's to Claire's point about empowering those individuals as well through education stuff. That's really important. So just moving on to, I'm going to hand over to Ailey for part two. We're going to go into a semi-deep dive into microaggressions as much as we can in such a short session. But Ailey, over to you.
Yeah, of course. So obviously line managers, like we were saying, do have a duty to be able to recognize microaggressions and understand when it's happening in the workplace. I've seen in the chat that sorry, I think it's disappeared because there's so much chat going on here. It's great. But somebody said that they felt like they were a victim of racism and that they had tried to talk to their line manager about it and that it was dismissed by their line manager. And that's really sad. I'm sorry that happened to you. And hopefully that line manager at some point will have training on unconscious bias and microaggressions so that they know how to intercept it in the future.
Just a question, how, like, because I think that's quite important, how would you expect if you're not getting sort of enough, because it's also bearing in mind what Claire's mentioned about line managers being quite fatigued at the moment as well, that there is a balance off shift about sort of that responsibility they have as well. So just be interesting to hear, Claire or Matthew, if you've got any comments around what you think that individual could do in that situation. So either of you, if want to chip in, if you've got any ideas.
I mean, I think you need to, where we are in a place now where you can't let this not be noted, and you have to find somebody else. If your line manager is not listening, you need to go and speak to somebody else in the business who can check in with the line manager and have the conversation with them to make them maybe rethink their response. But I think we're in a world now where the idea of you just having to deal with it and suck it up no longer is acceptable, if it ever was. But I do think you have to go and have, if you think you can't get that line manager to get the point you have to find someone else to go and have that conversation with the line manager.
I think organisations are putting more in place as well to try and combat that, in the way of like having procedures where, you know, there's even anonymous, or some organisations have anonymous ways of like sort of feeding back information like that about stuff that's happening.
You could even be going to your multicultural network, if you have one of those within your organisation. If you don't feel that you could speak to anyone else, then that's always an option if you have that available in your organisation, definitely.
Right, so microaggressions.
Microaggressions, yeah.
I'm just conscious we're not going to get through that area, and I think it's so important that we understand where we're going and how to combat that. So
yeah. So microaggressions are a result of unconscious bias. So unconscious bias you've probably heard of. It leads to discriminatory behaviours, and really often those behaviours don't align with how we view ourselves or our personal beliefs. They're normally committed by really well-intentioned people. So I'm sure all of us here have committed microaggressions at some point. I know I have, and often we're not even aware that we've said anything offensive. It feeds back into what Sarah was talking about earlier with systemic and interpersonal and institutional. So we're not aware that we've said anything offensive most of the time, and we might have even intended it to be a compliment. And you know, very often that is not the case. It's about checking your behaviours and questioning. And we'll go into microaggressions a bit later, just to talk about, you know, what a certain thing, what it sounds like and what it actually means. So microaggressions are brief and commonplace daily verbal, behavioural or environmental indignities that communicate hostile, derogatory or negative prejudicial slights against any group, particularly racially marginalised groups. So it's part of everyday racism. So this is what happens. Microaggressions are very often what happen in the workplace. And we'll go through some in a minute, and I'm sure some of you will recognise them as having happened in your own workplace. So hopefully we should.
Oh, you're breaking up a bit, Ailey. We've also got a video as part of the toolkit as well, which gives you some more examples. But Ailey, are you back on?
Okay, so the first one, if you can all hear me now, but where are you really from, also known as where are you originally from? So do you want to just write in the chat quickly if you think this is a microaggression, what it means, and I'll give you the answer in just a second. Yes, everybody's saying yes. Yeah, exactly. That's probably the one that most people should know by now. So, but where are you really from suggests that you are an alien in your own country, and that being British is associated with being white, or being European is associated with being white. So yeah, that's absolutely a microaggression. A question we often get asked about this one is, does that mean that you're not allowed to ask anyone where they're from? no, it doesn't mean that. But when they tell you where they're from, it means that you have to accept that. So there's no going back and saying, oh, but you're from London, but where are you really from? That's where the microaggression occurs. So number 2, you are so articulate. Do we think that that is a microaggression? Yes, yes, no, yes, 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 it absolutely is. So if you say to a person of color, if you say to a Black, Asian, or minority ethnic person, you are so articulate, that assumes that you expected them not to be. So you're assigning supposed intelligence to somebody just based on the color of their skin. So yes, that is absolutely a microaggression. So number 3, being mistaken for hospitality at a work event. So I think we can all agree, I don't even have to ask that one. Yes, capital letters, yes. That is absolutely a microaggression. And it happens very often. I'm sure it's happened to lots of people of color. If anybody's on right now, you know, you have mistaken identity. So it's assumed that you don't have a certain education or you don't have a certain profession or ability because of your race. There was a Twitter user the other month, I think Essex Barrister, who was repeatedly mistaken as a defendant when she was the barrister. So going into court stopped multiple times, and that happens very often. So number 4, Senkup, tricky name. Can I call you Sam? Yes, 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 your name is inconvenient. Yes, exactly. So only accepting white or Western names as legitimate because they're too tricky to pronounce. Obviously, my name is a Gaelic spelling, so I very often have the same issue. So number 5, so to a Black woman with a new weave, how did you grow it, or how did your hair grow so quickly? So what do we think? Is that a microaggression? Yeah, yeah.
This is when we have the most people sort of normally respond saying they're not sure, isn't it? In the past we have.
So natural Black hair at work, yes, is a very political subject. So it's ignorance, unsure. No, just ignorance, said Dolores. Yeah, okay, so that is a microaggression. You can comment on how good somebody's hair looks, but to make a point about it having grown so quickly, obviously that is a microaggression. So number 6,
it's a subtle one. It is highlighting how there's, you know, this compounding effect of if you're regularly hearing sort of these sort of comments in the workplace. So this is really good to see how subtle they are as well.
And you're allowed to compliment people, but you know, think about how you're wording it before you compliment people. So number 6, I'm assuming that you don't celebrate Christmas. So yes, so that would be an assumption that mixes all different kinds of things together, like faith, ethnicity, culture, just based on the color of somebody's skin. So yes, that is absolutely a microaggression. So number 7, oh, but I don't think of you as Asian, or I don't think of you as Black. It's also known as color blindness. Yes, sigh, says Raj. Yep, absolutely. So color blindness, a lot of well-intentioned people think of color blindness as a compliment. It's not. So you're denying somebody's lived identity by saying that you don't see color. If you didn't see color, then you know there would be no systemic racism, and everything would be the same, and meritocracy would work, which it doesn't. Okay, so number 8, it should be about the most qualified person getting the jobs. This is what we were talking about earlier with Matthew, the myth of meritocracy. Yes, yes, absolutely, yes, yes. So equality versus equity. So that comes down to equality versus equity. So there are obviously additional obstacles, a lot more obstacles for minority ethnic groups to getting opportunities. So it's definitely not about the most qualified person getting the job. And I think we all know that. So number 9, in appraisals, you need to work on your attitude. Yeah.
This is another one that comes up as a bit of a theme around, question mark around as well.
Yeah. So that probably comes down to respectability politics. Borderline, says Raj. Yeah.
But yeah,
charged. Yeah, absolutely.
I think the question is, would you use the same sort of phrases and terminology with someone based on, you know, like based on their race? So like if they were a white person, and this one's a bit borderline, I would say, number 9.
Yeah.
Okay.
Great.
We're ready to move on?
Well, should we move on to talking about, yeah, so microaggressions? So if you want to bring them all up, if you could just click through.
Yeah. Oh, have I gone off the slide? Oh, it's trying to play it, that's why. Here we go. Okay. So
microaggressions we can think of as mosquito bites. Some of you might have heard this analogy before. So experiencing microaggressions every day can be like getting mosquito bites over and over and over again. So one might be fine for you. Maybe you're not really affected by mosquito bites. And one mosquito bite is fine. But when you are bitten by mosquitoes over and over again, every single day, and it never heals, and you constantly have more coming up, you know, it's really painful and it's impossible to ignore. And so microaggressions are often described as mosquito bites. An important point to remember about this is that obviously mosquito bites affect people in different ways, and so do microaggressions. So Sarah might have a really bad reaction to getting bitten by a mosquito, and Margaret doesn't really have a reaction when she gets bitten by a mosquito. So even one microaggression can be enough. You know, for Sarah, who's allergic to mosquitoes, it could be enough, just one. So these are some of the outcomes of microaggressions, how they can affect people. So we've got unable to reach potential, imposter syndrome, low battery, disenfranchised, low self-esteem, othering, exclusion, exhaustion, and fear for safety.
And there is this video online as well, the video where the picture's shown that we've got as part of our toolkit, which is a great resource and shows you in a video format the effects of microaggressions as well. Before we go on to looking at how to positively interrupt, it'd be great on chat as well to hear some of the microaggressions that you feel you might have experienced, or even if you've got any questions around microaggressions, because they are so subtle sometimes, it's really hard to tell. But I wanted to go back to our speakers and ask, before we go into how to interrupt these sort of behaviours, how would you advise managers within your teams, or how would you advise like colleagues to deal with microaggressions when they see them? If we could go to Matthew first.
I find it quite difficult to be prescriptive on this one because it depends so much on the individual circumstance and there are judgments to be made on your feet. But I guess it's the non-negotiable bit, it seems to me, is, well, first of all, you've got to invest in recognizing microaggressions. I think we all have a responsibility to listen to things like this, for example, to make sure that we are sensitized to microaggressions and the impact they can have on people. I think that's non-negotiable. But the next non-negotiable bit, I think, is for a line manager, is whatever we do, we cannot just ignore it. We cannot say that is just banter or that is just XYZ person. But the responses, I find, can range anything from, you know, in the moment calling it out as being unacceptable, not the way the organization operates, whatever the appropriate formulation is, through to maybe a quiet word in the ear after that moment has passed, and then maybe having moved the conversation on to safer territory of the person who's committed the microaggression, to make sure that they understand the impact of what they've said. But then I think the other key piece of that is we've got to have that conversation with the person who was made uncomfortable by the microaggression as well, to make sure that they recognize that institutionally those who are responsible for our organizations, the line managers or whomever else, you know, get that is a comment that can't be let to lie. And there are a whole range of other possibilities, but I think the most important thing for me is we cannot go back to a point Claire was making earlier. We're way beyond a world in which we can afford just to let that go.
And Claire is like, basically, because these microaggressions are sometimes so subtle, and also it's looking at, I know Matthew mentioned impact, so, you know, and to Ailey's point, sometimes they might impact people differently, or, you know, so Claire, how would you advise to create positive outcomes as well? So it's not always about naming and shaming. How would you advise people to deal with, and line managers to deal with, when they see microaggressions?
So we're trying to get into what we're calling a growth mindset.
Mm-hmm.
So that we are in a learning mindset, and therefore if one, we want to be in teams where they're not happening at all. So we obviously have to kill the microaggressions, but I think the way we think you should go about doing it is actually course correcting people in a, you need to understand that what you have done, not to sort of embarrass somebody, but more, you need to get on this learning journey, and you need to get your head around the impact that you're having on somebody, and it's time to educate yourself. So we're trying to do it in a growth way. I think it's about making sure people understand that they need to be team players, and it's really important, as Matthew was saying, is checking in on the person that's felt that microaggression, how they're doing. But I think when you talk about microaggression, you also have to talk about microaffirmation as well, and how important microaffirmations are in terms of making somebody feel like they belong. So in a nutshell, it's let's talk about it more. And some of those examples you've put up there on the screen. We had some sessions with our Black Affinity Network, and I literally had my head in my hands at some of the microaggressions that people had been hit with in our business. So there is a real understanding education piece. There is a growth mindset. You've got to develop here. You've got to learn. You've got to understand. And I think the micro affirmation, and that's why allyship is so important, is a really important counter to the microaggression.
I really like that, and it's about as well, like that positive part of it as well. It's not all about sort of pointing the finger. It's not really necessarily about that. It's about sort of also, how do we look at the objectives of moving this forward, and moving forward in this in a positive way, so the outcomes are sort of reached. But just going back to Ailey, so, and it'd be good to sort of get the involvement of those participants as well on that, Ailey.
Yeah, absolutely. So do you think you could click 3 times? Yeah, perfect. Thank you. So hopefully you can all see this on the screen. If not, I'll just read it out loud quickly for everyone. So there is a white man, and he's talking to an Asian woman, and he's saying, "You're so well spoken, and I presume you're great at financial modeling." So we've actually got the answer up on the screen, but we were going to ask you, we don't have much time anyway, we were going to ask you what you would do when you were faced with a microaggression like this in the workplace. What would you do? Would you intervene? What would you say?
And that might be different as a line manager to if you were in a situation where you're managing a team. So particularly in this instance, we're talking about if you are a line manager. So it's very different to if you're a colleague in that situation. As far as the accountability piece. If
you're a colleague, it can be difficult, especially if it's you know, somebody that's higher up than you. It can be difficult to call out that kind of behavior. Obviously there's a fear of reaction and repercussion. So sometimes if it's a microaggression that's been committed by somebody that is higher up than you, then you might have to weigh up the situation quite carefully in how you approach it. But in general, what we would say with this situation is that the burden to intervene and interrupt this behavior shouldn't be on the recipient. So you can see the Black woman saying, "Can you explain what you mean by that?" So that's an interruption. And that is very helpful with microaggressions. If you don't speak up in this kind of situation, essentially what you're signaling is that it's okay for this to happen. It's okay for somebody to say that. That person, that man might not even know that he has committed a microaggression. So he might think that he's actually paying a compliment by saying, I presume that you're great at financial modeling. You could also do something like say, sorry, can you explain what you mean by that? Or I don't understand what you mean by that. Alternatively, in private, you could later go back and give feedback and explain why it's a microaggression. So you could say, I know you probably didn't intend to say that, but when you said, I presume you're great at financial modeling, it was actually quite offensive. If you are white, it's really, really helpful to say, I've done that before, but actually I learned that it's not okay to say that because X, Y, Z. So lots of different things that you can do to interrupt behaviours.
We've got all these written down as well in the toolkit, haven't we, Ailey? So
yeah,
you know, if you want to refresh this, because it's a lot of information to take in, but the toolkit actually gives you some really great examples and how to interrupt that behaviour as well. So
especially in the workplace, the aim is not to shame somebody in these situations. That's probably the most important thing to remember, is that a lot of these mistakes will be unintended, and you know, people are still learning and we have to let them learn, but also we shouldn't let this kind of behavior pass by, like Claire said earlier.
Yeah, otherwise nothing's going to change.
Yeah.
Okay, so moving on to the last slide before, we're just doing a quick introduction into language and conversations. It's such an important part, but we haven't got time on this session to go into depth on it. But I just wanted to quickly, Ailey, if you can quickly go through this, and then we'll just do our final question.
So in conversations, if you think about perhaps if you are the person that has committed a microaggression, or that, you know, nobody's perfect, we're all bound to get things wrong. And, you know, even in the chat, I can see things that are making things spark in my head. So thank you, everybody. But I think the point here is to focus on the outcome, address the issue, recognize what's wrong, do better. And from that point on, sorry, Sarah, you've just moved to the next slide.
No, I can't even get back to it. There you go. Sorry.
So on this journey, you should probably get comfortable with saying, thank you for correcting me. I didn't realize. So this is on the other side of the microaggression. Or I hadn't thought of it like that and I understand now. Or I was wrong and I've changed my mind. I didn't know that. I'll do more research. So it's important to apologize. If you're in a situation where you've maybe been accused of a microaggression, then definitely apologize, try to do better moving forward.
It's a learning journey for everyone, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's key. And I just wanted to go on to the last question, because we've only got a few minutes left. And so if we couldn't answer everything, but it's been so much engagement on chat and it's been really great. So we will go through that and get back to anyone as well, if you've got your details. But do also get in touch with Margaret as well. If you've got any questions, it's margaret@spmgroup.co.uk. Just to last finish us off, what sort of highlight tips would you give if you wanted to give sort of around 3 sort of high level tips, or your one big tip that you would give to line managers, just to sort of conclude? So Matthew, over to you.
I'll go for 2, somewhere between your 1 and 3.
Okay. I like that.
For me personally, this is what helped a great deal. The first was talk to people of colour about issues of race in the firm, in life. What is the experience of what is your lived experience? What is it that grates with you about our organisation, about things that happen to you on a daily basis? And really that sort of gets you into sensitising yourself about microaggressions and the big structural issues as well. So talk to people. And the other related issue is read. There's so much good literature on this subject, and then there was a huge amount of it that came out during the course of last year, which I thought was really helpful. And so really invest in reading around this subject. If I could just personalize this, if I look back at myself, I think I was the classic non-racist. And going back to the colorblind point, I thought that was a badge of honor. I'm not a racist. I treat people equally, and that's cool. But it wasn't until I started being reverse mentored by one of the young black lawyers in our organization, and she talked me through her experience and her perception of me and my ilk, that I realized that that was just an utterly inadequate way of being for a person in my position, or for a person of my privilege. In other words, being a non-racist, because unless and until I started to recognize that I needed to be part of the solution, I was in fact part of the problem. So it was that realization of the difference that most people now get much better. I think that there's a big difference between non-racism and being actively anti-racist. The former, you're still the problem. And like that, I got through talking through. I couldn't speak highly enough, incidentally, about the concept of reverse mentoring. It's been really powerful in our organization. I personally found it very powerful. And then the reading. And the next big revelation for me was, it's a related issue, but different. And that is, for people like me, the cartoon character person of privilege that I described before, we continue to be part of the problem, even if we've become anti-racist, unless we recognize our own privilege. And that is a bit of a leap for someone who thinks that they've got where they've got through a lot of hard work and maybe a tiny bit of talent. It's a bit confronting for an old white guy. But you've got to get there, and reading and talking is what helps you achieve that, in my view. And just on the reading point, I've got two things that I think have been incredible. And the first one, it was the real game changer for me. And it was Rennie Edo-Lodge, Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. And you all will have heard of it. You can tell from my copy that it's heavily marked and got lots of post-it notes on it. It's become something of a reference work for me. And this is quite a challenging book for a 50 whatever I was year old male who had those preconceptions I talk about before, because it's confronting, but it's brilliantly argued, it's evidence-based, really compelling. And that for me was a real eye-opener and a game changer. Slightly different one. I had the great privilege actually of interviewing June Sarpong, a TV personality, during Black History Month, one of our events within the firm. And she wrote, the interview was about this book, So the Power of Privilege, which came out during the course of Black History Month. And what's interesting about this book is that it's less confronting, but still very blunt than the Rennie Edo-Lodge book, but it sort of speaks to someone like me. This is a how-to guide, and I think she's done a really good job of it, so I'd recommend it as well. And one of the things I said to her when I was interviewing her was, I was remembering just before this, that I said to her, she had me in the foreword because it's full of practical stuff, but in the foreword she says, this goes back to a point that was made earlier, there will be some uncomfortable moments, but getting comfortable with being uncomfortable is a major first step in making a real difference. And I think that really sums it up. It is uncomfortable territory, but we've got to invest in it in order to be effective allies, in my view.
Thanks, Matthew. People have asked what is a book, but we'll come back to that. Just Claire, just quickly some tips before. This has been a great session. I have to say, you both had great input.
I'll give three quick thoughts. Building on what Matthew said, it's about having that learning growth mindset in the organisation. You're on a journey. There's no magic potion. Everybody has to be learning, is my tip one. I would say my tip two is making it clear that every action counts, the small ones and the big ones. So just make sure you're bringing about change in your day-to-day roles, your day-to-day actions. And the third thing I would say is celebrate your allies, celebrate those that are doing the right things and taking the right actions. So you have that right mindset in your organisation.
Thank you, Claire. I love, Claire, your positivity around this. Sorry, Matthew.
So I was going to say, can I add a point on the point that Claire makes so brilliantly about do the little things count? One of the things that's blown me away is the impact of being visible, for example, at our affinity groups events, which are just super high quality. turning up, being visible, being vocal in those events has a huge impact on people in a way that I never got until I started getting that feedback. You know, we love that you turn up, and it's such an easy thing to do. And the more of us that do it, the more momentum we deliver and the more we break down the barriers. So some of it can be quite small.
No, that's really important. Thank you. Like, you've been excellent speakers, and it's brought everything to life and given us some really great sort of suggestions there. It's just testament to like how important this topic area is, that we've had people on the call really engaging in this. So thank you so much. If you do want to find out more, because we do lots of different sessions around privilege, but also ERGs and our Future Leaders track, do get in touch with us. And I put in the chat Margaret's details there, but you can get in touch with any of us. And a big thank you for our participants for all your engagement and your insights. They're, like, we're going to actually read through them properly afterwards, because I think there's some really useful things that we can learn. But also thank you to Matthew and Claire. Thanks for your input and taking the time out, because I know you're super busy. Some really great points there. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.
If there are any questions that we haven't been able to answer, then do feel free to email us as well. And Matthew's just holding up June's book.
It's the power of privilege. Is the short
Privilege is a
title.
really important part of like identity. Oh, there you go. Everyone can hold up. I think we should all come on and hold up our book about what we've learned and got the most out of.
Everyone.
Anyway, I will let you all go. Thank you very much.
Thank
you.
I'm seeing some great things on chat. Thank you, everybody. Bye. Bye.